sponsored by Skillshare. Hi guys, it's Claire, welcome back. Seeing as we are now in the chilly days of October, I thought I would finally bring you the second half of my summer reading wrap-up. I'm gonna link the first half down below, but otherwise let's dive right in. First up, I have The Vanishing Half by Bennett, which feels fitting because I feel like this was kind of the book of the summer. And this is actually not normally the type of book that I would pick up. It's a little more family drama, book club catnip than I tend to prefer, but I did read The Mothers by Bennett when it came out a few years ago, and although I wasn't a huge fan of that book, Bennett has been on my radar since then, and I felt like I wanted to give her another try. And on top of that, the premise of The Vanishing Half, I have to say, is pretty irresistible. It follows Stella and Desiree, who are two twin sisters and light-skinned Black women who leave their tiny Louisiana town as teenagers and whose destinies diverge when Stella decides to pass as white and forsake everything about her past, including Desiree. Stella marries a white man and has a blonde-haired, blue-eyed daughter named Kendi, and Desiree, conversely, marries a Black man and has a very dark-skinned Black daughter named Jude. And the novel follows these four women over the years and decades as their separate lives kind of lead them at times away from each other and at times back towards each other. And at the end of the day, I thought this book was totally just like fine. I liked it a lot more than The Mothers, and I found the character of Stella in particular fascinating. There's a section of the book where she is many years into passing as white when a Black family moves into her affluent neighborhood, and all of the dynamics of that situation were so tense and taut and just like crackling with narrative possibility. And I really wish that the book as a whole had been that kind of tight and propulsive. I think that from a plot standpoint, I wanted a little bit more punch from this book. Like, if we're gonna have all these unlikely coincidental run-ins, you might as well lean into it and really have some fireworks. And instead, the story left me feeling kind of emotionally subdued and just like unruffled in a weird way. And I think that might be partly because Bennett writes in a way that relies heavily on flashbacks and kind of backward-looking narrative exposition, and so much so that you kind of rarely feel like you're ever just sitting still in the present moment with a particular character. And it creates this effect of just kind of skimming and rushing over the surface of these characters' lives. And so I think that that might have been part of why I felt emotionally removed from a lot of the story. Next up, I have a book that I read for Women in Translation Month this year, and that is Tokyo Ueno Station by Miri, translated by Morgan Giles. And this is a very bite-sized book that follows an elderly man named Kazu who has recently died and whose ghost or spirit is lingering around Tokyo Ueno Park as he kind of looks back on his life and the various misfortunes that befell him, in part because of social inequity and in part because of just pure bad luck. And his life, like everyone's, I suppose, is tied in a way to the key events in his nation's history. His son is born on the same day in 1960 as the Crown Prince of Japan. He first arrives in Tokyo in 1964 to help work and build and prepare for the Olympics that year. He is from Fukushima Prefecture, which is later devastated by the 2011 earthquake and tsunami and subsequent nuclear disaster. And so it's this very small book about a life that I think a lot of people would deem similarly small or insignificant, but Miri is able to embed Kazu's story with this historical weight and significance and also with this emotional heft. And this is the kind of small, mournful book that I was hoping I was going to grow more and more fond of over time after I had finished reading it, and instead it ended up leaving like zero impression on either my mind or my heart or my soul. Like, genuinely everything I just said about the plot and its historical heft, I had completely forgotten until I sat down to prep this video. And even now I'm like remembering the final image of the book, which is so powerful and devastating, and yet somehow it like evaporated from my consciousness the second I closed the book. So recommended with reservations, I guess. Then I have Big Friendship, How We Keep Each Other Close by Friedman and Aminatou, who are best friends and co-hosts of the popular podcast Call Your Girlfriend. And I have been a sporadic to semi-regular CYG listener over the years, so I read this book mostly out of human interest just to learn a little bit more about Anne and Amina's friendship, but the book also expounds on their theory of big friendship, which they define as a bond of great strength, force, and significance that transcends life phases, geography, and emotional shifts, which I guess is just a fancy way of saying close friendship. And I enjoyed this book while reading it. It talks about their friendship, and they bring in some experts to talk about the significance of platonic, non-familial relationships. But I guess the other thing that I remembered when reading this book is that Anne and Amina are, I think, a lot more into like marketing and branding terminology and like theorifying things than I am. For example, not only do they repackage close friendship as big friendship, but they also talk about things like your friend web, your friendship story, your story of sameness, that kind of thing. And it honestly just like stresses me out more than anything. Like, I'm all for us as a culture treating friendship with the same seriousness that we treat romantic and familial relationships, but I guess I also don't think that it needs to like be this much work. I don't know. Everyone's different. Maybe I'm like a little more intuitive in the way that I make and maintain friendships. But I also think the book is oriented from the perspective of two people who are relatively young, female, pretty social, who have spent the majority of their adult life in cities where it's fairly easy to kind of maintain these networks and webs of friendships. And I don't think that everyone else's relationship with friendship necessarily mirrors that. So I do think this book is a little bit limited in scope and also a little bit one size fits all in terms of its advice about how to establish and maintain friendships. So I guess if you fall into that demographic, or if you're a regular CYG listener, you might find this book interesting, but I also wouldn't really recommend it to anyone beyond that. Next up, I read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi as part of a book club that was being held at work in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer. And to be completely honest, I don't think this is the kind of book I would have picked up on my own, because when it comes to kind of complex socio-political, cultural, historical issues like racism, I think I tend to gravitate towards fiction that explores those topics or ideas, or on the flip side, nonfiction books that focus on either like primary source material or that provides a historical account and analysis. Books like, as an example, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which is also by Ibram X. Kendi. That being said, I ended up finding this book really, really valuable. It's less the kind of anti-racist instructional self-help guidebook that I was expecting, and more an extremely comprehensive but concise, almost reference book that's very focused on providing readers with very simple but direct definitions of things like anti-racist policy, racial discrimination, assimilationist policy, segregationist policy, etc., etc. Each chapter focuses on a different kind of racism, be it biological racism, cultural racism, class racism, and each chapter always starts with very clear and simple definitions of those things. Each chapter is also then supplemented and grounded by these real life examples, many of them from Ibram Kendi's own life. And there is a great deal of generosity and humility in those memoir-ish passages in particular, where Kendi recounts moments in his own life where he perpetuated racist ideas about class, gender, sexuality, etc. And I think that generosity gives the reader a lot of space to kind of be honest with themselves about the ways in which they too have participated in or perpetuated racist ideas or racist policies. So yeah, I think this book is a really valuable tool and resource to have on hand. And even in the couple of months since I've read it, I have found myself referencing it or calling back to it in conversations that I've been having with friends and family. Having this book as kind of a foundation to stand on when having those conversations has been very helpful. So yeah, I highly recommend this book and I'm very glad that I read it. Then I have Reading the Romance, Women, Patriarchy, and Popular Literature by Janice A. Radway. This was recommended to me by a friend who was reading some of Janice Radway's work as part of her PhD field exams. This was published by the University of North Carolina Press back in 1984, so it's a pretty dated but still fascinating look at the romance genre, romance reading as an activity, and the reading habits and preferences of a small group of women located in what Radway calls Smithtown, Middle America. And there are sections of this book that are incredibly academic, like the first chapter is literally titled The Institutional Matrix, so it can be a little bit dense and repetitive in the way that academic argumentation can be, and the sample group of romance readers that it looks at is extremely homogenous, both in terms of demographics and also in terms of reading taste. So it's also limited in that sense, but there's still a ton of really, really interesting stuff here. And reading it also kind of as its own sort of historical document was also super fascinating, especially with regard to the way that Janice Radway in the book is trying to work out what the relationship between romance readers and feminists should be. Her extremely sharp delineation between those two groups feels incredibly dated when you read it now, but it also in a way kind of just goes to show how far romance as a genre and feminism in some ways have come respectively. But yeah, very interesting. Definitely recommend it to romance readers who might be interested in learning a little bit more about the history of the genre. And I'll also talk about this book a little bit more in a larger discussion video about the romance genre that I'm working on, which will hopefully be ready to go later this month. In addition to reading the romance, I have also been reading a lot of romances in preparation for that discussion video. So I'll save most of my thoughts about the following books for that video, but I did want to kind of run through them and give you some of my quick impressions. Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. Based on the cover alone, I thought this was going to be a budget red, white, and royal blue because the cover is definitely a knockoff of that cover, but this was more of its own thing than I was expecting. Very Bridget Jones in terms of a kind of messy hero and an uptight lawyer love interest. It was a little bit too long, too much time spent with secondary characters who were only kind of funny, but ultimately pretty cute and charming. An Extraordinary Union by Alyssa Cole. This is set during the Civil War and features an interracial couple and quite a bit of espionage. The whole book was really well done, especially when it came to the central relationship. The whole dynamic between the hero and the heroine was just excellent, I thought. This was my first historical romance, and I have to say there was like a little bit too much plot for me. I was a little bit too stressed out at the end, which makes sense given the setting and the times, but not necessarily my favorite kind of escapism. The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. This might be the horniest book I've ever read. This book is about an autistic woman who hires an escort to help teach her how to get better at sex, and early sex scenes in the book are used in part as a kind of character development, and then the characters stop developing and are just boning all the time. Surprisingly though, this book also managed to be extremely sweet and cute, but the conflict in the third act was also one of the dumbest things I've ever read. The Wall of Winnipeg and Me by Mariana Zapata. This book is self-published excellence. Definitely didn't need to be 600 pages long, but I loved almost every minute of it. I think it's a testament to Mariana Zapata that I didn't find the hero in this book personally appealing to me, and yet I was fully in the tank and gunning for this couple. Masterful slow burn, literally nothing happens in this book. 5 stars. Lastly, this video is kindly sponsored by Skillshare, which is an online learning platform that offers thousands of classes for creative and curious people looking to develop new skills and explore their passions. I recently took a Skillshare class called Modern Watercolor Techniques, taught by artist and designer Kat Coquillette. which was really fun and relaxing and had a ton of great tips about how to make your watercolors look more modern, how to fix mistakes, and things like recommended brush size and paper type, which was super helpful for a non-artistic newbie like myself. Skillshare classes have interactive projects and will help connect you to a community of millions of other online learners. Courses are designed to fit your busy schedule, and Skillshare is also one of the most affordable ways to learn online, with annual premium membership coming in at less than $10 a month. If you're interested in checking out Skillshare, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description box below will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Those are all of the rest of the books that I read this summer. I hope everyone is having a cozy fall so far. Let me know what you've been reading, particularly any seasonal books that you've been curling up with, and if you have thoughts about any of the books mentioned here, definitely let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!